Genesis chapter 32. And in leaving Genesis 31, we had Jacob finally leaving Haran. You can, while you're getting there, I'll just kind of give you the background or what happened last week kind of thing. And he is disentangling himself from the family that's there in Haran. He had, no wealth, no worldly goods, basically, because when he moved there, he was all by himself and he worked for Laban, and his wages were women. It wasn't cattle and tents and camels. It was, he worked for the two wives that he has. And so he devised a plan where he could gain wealth off of Laban. And now that he had worked the 14 years, he would now gain cattle. And I'm using cattle loosely. I think it does apply to all livestock, which would be goats and sheep and cows and whatever else they had. Cattle can even apply to camels, if you will, but I don't really know that much about that, so forgive me if I'm wrong about that. But then he's got to remove himself from that family because God visits him and tells him, it's time for you to move back to Canaan, because God's people are supposed to be in the promised land, which is Canaan. So Canaan is where Abraham moved to, where Isaac never left and he always lived. And Jacob was born there with his brother Esau. But remember, and this is important background for chapter 32 that we're going to study tonight, remember that Jacob stole the blessing and the birthright from his brother. And he's at odds with his brother. And his brother wanted to kill him, but he didn't want to grieve Isaac, their father, over it, because that would definitely grieve a parent if one child killed the other. And so he wanted to wait. And so Rebecca, who is Jacob's mother, told him, you should leave. You should go back to where my family is, which is back where Abraham's family was, back in Haran, and stay there. She says a couple of days from what I remember, cool off a couple of days. Well, he was there for 20 years. And when he came away from Haran, which is where we are now, he has many, 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 many children, and he has servants, and he has two wives with two maids, I think they called them, and he has children with those maids. So, they are definitely embroiled within the family. And he, in chapter 31, has disentangled himself from that family. And that chapter closed with a truce. Laban is a shyster, and Jacob is smart to get away from him. Not only is he smart, but he's also obeying God and going back to his homeland, the land of his people. Now, remember, nobody with him. This is no one else's homeland except for Jacob's, which is, I think, pretty interesting. And his wives are willing to go with him. They're frustrated with their father. I said last week, but it was 2 weeks ago, because last week I was needing to fret over the youth retreat, but hadn't started, and it was Thursday night. so anyway, but 2 weeks ago, we talked about how when Jacob presented his wives, he went out and had like a secret meeting in the field with them and said, it's time for us to go back. They were game. They were happy to go back. They were insulted, it seems, by what their father had done by practically selling them. And there was nothing left for them. So as far as inheritance, they had suspected that their father was taking all of it, which is despicable, really, because Laban was very wealthy. And what we're going to find in this chapter is that Jacob is anxious about going back. So why would he be anxious? What reasons would he have to be anxious to go back home? Anybody want to contribute?
Well, his brother might still be looking for him.
Mm-hmm. Brother might still be breathing murder against him, right?
And he didn't have any idea of what's happened in his homeland while he's been gone all those years.
That's right. I mean, it sounds so silly to say, but there was no Facebook. There was even no Pony Express. You know what I mean? Where there were letters taken between the two places. So who even knows what the situation is going to be there? Is Esau still there? Is Esau still mad? Right? Is Esau head of the family because he is the oldest son? And yes, Jacob has his birthright and his blessing, but Jacob wasn't around. So, is that what he's going to run into when he goes back home to these people? Let's see. As far as the home people know, and we're going to see in this chapter, Jacob has changed a lot in these 20 years. Hopefully we all change if we have 20 years to grow, right? But Jacob has grown. I mean, he's grown because he's become a servant in another man's house. He's grown because he's become a husband and a father and a patriarch of his own family. That grows up a person for sure. But according to the people at home, Jacob is still the supplanter. Do you remember? That's what his name means. He was destined, and I'm using that term pretty loosely, but he was predetermined or prophesied that he was going to be the one that ousts people out of the position that they're in. But sometimes that word is also used as like a trickster and a deceiver. So Jacob, the supplanter, the deceiver, the overthrower, at this point, as far as we know about him, still tries to advance himself and attain blessings by his own power and trickery, as far as we know. We're not told yet that he has a personal relationship with God. If you look just ahead, we're going to read this in a minute, but in chapter 32 and verse 9 of Genesis, we see that Jacob still has determined that this God is his father's God, the God of his fathers. Later in the Bible, God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, not yet. Verse 9 says, Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. This is the beginning of a prayer that we'll look at in a few minutes. But do you see how he addresses him? It's similar to me, if you can remember back when we suppose it was Eleazar, the servant of Abraham, that went to Haran to find a wife for Isaac. Remember, Abraham was the first one to receive the promise and the blessing from God. Isaac was his son of promise that he had at 100 years old. And then it was time for Isaac to have a wife. And so Abraham sends his servant back to his people in Haran. And his servant says to Laban there, he says, may the God of Abraham bless you. May the God that Abraham serves be a witness in this circumstance. So Eleazar did not claim him to be his God. And here, notably, Jacob doesn't either. It is notable. Remember that Jacob has just spent 20 years in a land where there are idolaters. Do you remember one of the issues when Jacob is trying to leave was that Laban's daughter Rachel stole the household idols, whatever those were. I mean, that's kind of just a term that we're told, the household idols. So there were idols of worship, objects of worship that were in Laban's home that Rachel valued for some reason, whether for the monetary value or for the fact that she wanted to take them with her because she believed in them. It was, like a lucky charm type of thing. But we don't know, we're not given those details. But what we do know is, there's a big detail, they were idol worshipers. We also know that from Joshua, I think chapter 24, if I remember correctly. But that's where Jacob just spent 20 years of his life, raising his family in this world of idolatry. So said all that to say, he's not yet claimed God Almighty as his God. And I think he must know that once you claim God as your God, that's it. He's the only God. But again, we're not really given that detail, and I could be reading into it, just don't think I am. So he still sees God as his father's God, but he did make a pact with God and a promise at Bethel. Remember when he fled 20 years ago? And he knows that God is keeping God's end of the bargain. But now the time has come that he has to return to Bethel and keep his part of the bargain. Now the time has come for God to become Jacob's God. This is a turning point in Jacob's life. Now the time has come for Jacob to return home and repossess the promised land. It is to be in his family, and his family is to be in that land. And so this is a big, big change of lifetime for Jacob. And he's leaving conflict behind, right? With Laban. I mean, he had conflict at every turn, but he is actually dreading the conflict that is ahead of him. He's got this conflict everywhere he goes. Jacob, the supplanter, Jacob, the deceiver and the overthrower. So let me read chapter 32, verses 1 and 2. Genesis 32, 1 and 2. Now, as Jacob went on his way, the angels of God met him. Jacob said when he saw them, "This is God's camp." So he named that place Mahanaim. Now, some of you might have "This is God's army" in your translation, and that's actually a better translation. So
That says God's host.
the host, okay. And host is also a word for army. So, you know, we don't have too much of the story here, but a good question is, why do the angels meet Jacob? Why do you suppose the angels with God's army, an army of angels, meet Jacob at this point? Could it be assurance? We've got your back kind of thing, you know? Could it be like that? He's got the backing of God's army behind him because he is very anxious about this return. So it could be that. Remember that God has promised to be with him, and now he actually has proof of that. I think it's a great scene, a really beautiful scene. And he saw them and he says, "This is the army of God." And it also might be telling Jacob, you do not travel alone, which is funny because he's not alone. He's part of the problem with this whole getting his wives on board kind of thing before they left, was because this is a big, big, big job and a big caravan, and they don't want to lose anyone along the way. So he's not alone, but he is alone in some ways. Being the patriarch of a family is a lot of stress, and it's a lot of being consumed with details and facts. And is everybody being fed? And is everybody being clothed? You know, to have the weight of your entire family on your back is very, very difficult. I remember my mother, as a single mom for 5 years, felt that strain. It was such a strain on her. And she was a believer. She is a great believer in God, but still fretted a lot at nighttime. You know, how are we going to make our ends meet? How are we going to live on this shoestring that we have? And Jacob has that. But now he's got this assurance of the army of God behind him. You're not doing this alone. You're not traveling alone. Remember, his trip back to Canaan is in obedience to God. Probably would have been easier for him not to do that. But he is obeying God by doing this. So let's see. Let's read verses 3 through verse 20. So Genesis 32, 3 through 20. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He also commanded them, saying, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen and donkeys and flocks and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my Lord that I may find favor in your sight. So before I go all the way through 20, we see that Jacob sends gifts ahead of him to try and appease Esau. And also a message. Look how he tells them to address Esau. Let's see. First of all, he says to the messenger, thus you shall say to my lord Esau. That's a beautiful, humble way to address him. And then the servant is to say, to call Jacob Esau's servant. He says, thus says your servant Jacob. And then he gives the story of his living with Laban and what he has to give Esau. So I just like to mention here, that's a lot different than Jacob the shyster, than Jacob the supplanter. We're getting Jacob, I don't know, the finesser, Jacob, the man who is looking ahead with prudence and carefulness. That's 20 years, I guess. Okay, verse 6, Genesis 32:6. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and furthermore, he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. 400 men. Verse 7, then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people who were with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 companies. For he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the company which is left will escape. So he's also taking pains to protect his family. You see that? So if one of them is attacked, not all of them will perish, or not all of them will be in peril. And that's also very smart and very prudent. Then Jacob said, verse 9, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. I am unworthy of all the loving kindness and of all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. For with my staff only I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, and he will come and attack me and the mothers with the children. For you said, I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which is too great to be numbered. So it's so funny, interesting, I guess, the way that Jacob approaches this. It's as if he's just taken into account all that he has. I mean, he knows all that he has. It was remember, a great undertaking to move everything he has. I mean, listen, when's the last time you moved a whole household? It is not fun. It's a nightmare, right? And so he has assessed all that he has. But here, it almost seems during this prayer that he's reflecting on everything he sees in front of him. I came across the Jordan and I had nothing but a staff in my hand. And now look at all that's ahead of me. I've got 2 companies, which is the 2 companies he divided everyone into. I've got so much that I had to divide it up, which is beautiful. And verse 10 is also very beautiful. He said, I'm unworthy of everything that you have blessed me with. It makes me think of John 1, is it 26, where it says that we've been giving grace upon grace, all of these beautiful blessings. But he says, I'm unworthy of all the loving kindness and of all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. So the first word, loving kindness, it's pretty descriptive just by what words are there. Love and kindness, right? Those things that have been shown to Jacob. But look at the next word that he says, all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. Faithfulness is a really great description of God, because when God says it, he's going to be faithful to it. It may not, of course, as we see from Old and New Testament, may not always look the way we think it's supposed to look, but God is faithful. And that's a beautiful word to describe him. And it's a great word to describe anybody that you know here on earth. You know, if you can say about them, they're a faithful spouse, they're faithful in business, they're faithful to the things that they say they would do. Or I remember Katie and I years ago, do you remember listening to that lady? Her last name was Gentry, I think. Oh, I can't think of her first name, but she did a whole lesson on a woman of integrity. Do you remember that from Oklahoma Christian? Oh, everybody froze. Probably me that froze.
Rose.
Okay,
Yeah,
I froze, right? Sorry about
here
that.
she is.
Katie, do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, it was a great lesson. I mean, it stayed with me. It was being a woman of integrity. And it was like, your yes should be yes and your no, no. Well, God's yes is always yes, and his no is always no. Beautiful. And he's not wishy-washy. Remember the difference? I brought it up so many times, but it's really notable. The difference between an idol and God. You know, an idol, see the random things I have on my desk. I could make an idol out of this spool of thread. I haven't put it away yet, Alexa. I could make an idol out of this spool of thread. And if, so anything clothes related, you know, this is the spool of thread that controls it. So if I, you know, rip the pants, my knee, the knee of my pants or my jacket or something, I could imagine that I'm not appeasing this spool of thread. And so I have to do whatever it is to please it. It seems so ridiculous. You know, I see everybody kind of smiling about that. It's no different than when you worship the sun, you know, and you imagine, well, I wasn't good enough today, and therefore the sun didn't come out and shine on all of my crops. Or we had a great big freeze, you know, and so you just imagine ways to appease the God of the sun or the God of the weather. And that's why you get those pictures in the Old Testament of the prophets of Baal slashing themselves and bleeding out and, you know, just throwing themselves on the rocks, doing anything they could to this made up, imaginary, powerful God. Well, that's a different picture than what we're getting here in Genesis. And the fact that Jacob is calling him a God who shows faithfulness means that God is steady. And we see it even more later, of course, after they come out of Egypt and God lays down, tells them exactly what he expects of them. The God of the sun, that imaginary God of my spool of thread, is not giving us the exactly what's expected, or we would know, we wouldn't be guessing. Anyway, I'll move on from that. So I'm going to start reading in verse 13, Genesis 32:13. So he, Jacob, spent the night there. Then he selected from what he had with him a present for his brother Esau. So more gifts here. 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels. That's a really weird phrase in my mind, a milking camel, and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He delivered them into the land of his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on before me and put a space between droves. He commanded the one in front, saying, when my brother Esau meets you and asks you, saying, to whom do you belong, and where are you going, and to whom do these animals in front of you belong? Then you shall say, these belong to your servant Jacob. It is a present sent to my lord Esau, and behold, he is also behind us. Then he commanded also the second and the third, and all those who followed the drove, saying, after this manner you shall speak to Esau when you find him, and you shall say, behold, your servant Jacob also is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me. Then afterward I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So this is a different kind of working through a problem than before, right? The way that the people up in Haran worked through problems was they cheated and they stole and they lied and they did whatever they had to do to propel themselves into the position that they wanted to be in. But this is different. This is Jacob actually giving. So this would be sacrificing to his brother, not in a worshipful way, but in a way that says, you mean something to me. I value you. I am honoring you with, wow, all of these animals. I mean, look at how many animals. That's why it's going to be several days before he gets to Jacob, and he wants them to warn him. Jacob wants his servants to warn Esau. These are all from your servant Jacob. These are all from your servant Jacob, who values you and loves you and wants a relationship with you. And by the way, he's behind us, right? It's preparing him. It's similar to, I thought, the way that Esther prepared a whole feast for her husband, the king, before she let him know the request that she had of him. Just kind of greasing those wheels. And I just love that seems like a more mature way to handle a problem than what they were doing in Haran. So let's see. So he sends a message ahead to Esau, and we see this model of humility, right? How many times he says, your servant Jacob, my lord Esau. It's like he's begging his favor. And it really seems like an honest attempt to remove any lingering anger that Esau might have. Maybe dampen down his anger a little bit. And it's also clear that Jacob wants to be reconciled to his brother. Remember, the word reconcile means back together. So there's a rift, there's a problem, they're estranged. I mean, one wants to murder the other one. And after 20 years, I wonder if Jacob thought, I've grown up. I wonder if Esau's grown up, but he doesn't know. But he definitely wants to be reconciled with his brother. And you can tell by the speech, the way he's talking to him, right? He doesn't say, before we were born, God said I was going to supplant you, right? He didn't say that. He didn't say, remember the story? I came out holding on to your heel, and that was significant, He didn't say you were so starving from the field that you foolishly disregarded your birthright and sold it to me. I mean, that was like an honest transaction. He doesn't say any of those things. He says, I am your servant. You are my Lord, or a master, in that you're above me. And I want you to have all that I'm giving you. And the list is amazing. 200 goats, 220 goats, 220 ewes, lambs, 30 milking camels and their colts, 40 cows, 10 bulls, donkeys, just unbelievable. I wouldn't even know what to do with one of each of those things, Can you imagine? Oh my goodness, I can't imagine. But this is an agricultural society. These gifts are currency. This is like giving a great big pile of money, or writing a gigantic check and putting it before you, trying to reconcile, trying to make amends in some ways.
Right.
And one of the commentators I was reading used the word prudence. He acts with prudence, and prudence is defined as right reason in action. It's being careful. It's do you remember, was it George Bush, the first George Bush, who said it wouldn't be prudent? He used that word and kind of threw that word back into our culture. That just means it wouldn't be careful and smart. Proverbs 14 and verse 15 says that a prudent man looks where he's going. In Ephesians 5, it says that we should walk not as unwise men, but circumspect, which means circum, like a circle, and spect, like your eyes, looking around you and being aware. And that's what Jacob is doing here. He's being prudent. He's being circumspect. I don't like to use a lot of words that we don't use in our vernacular, in our culture every day, but sometimes they're very descriptive. So Jacob does become fearful. If you look back in verse 7, he becomes, my version says, greatly afraid and distressed upon hearing what news? Upon hearing that there are 400 men with his brother. He doesn't know if they're coming to obliterate him, if they're coming to, take everything that he has. He doesn't know. And so he is greatly afraid and distressed. But unlike many people who become afraid and distressed, it almost seems like he becomes more sober-minded, because that's when he divides up his family, and that's when he prays to God. So how would Jacob normally deal in this situation? I mean, we don't know because we can't probably make it up. But what we do know is lie, cheat, and steal, whatever it took to get what you wanted. Remember, that is where he came from. I wonder if he saw so much of that or experienced so much of it with his father-in-law Laban that he realized that's not the way to be. Besides growing up in 20 years and becoming a father and being patriarch of a family and having all the responsibility that takes and grows you up, he witnessed, he was a victim of Laban a lot, where Laban just took him for granted and took what he wanted. So he's definitely learned and come a long way, which is great news, because Jacob, whose name becomes Israel in just a few more verses, is a father of a nation. And you don't want the father of the nation of God's people to be a shyster. So let's see. So he divides up his family, then he attempts to pacify Esau. I thought I had, and actually hold him off a little bit by sending gifts ahead. So he buys himself a little bit of time, sends so many gifts ahead, and actually puts space between each of, they call them droves, but each of the groups of gifts. But most importantly, he prays. So most importantly, before this great encounter, he talks to God, and he prays to the God of his fathers, but he recognizes that he's dependent on God to deliver him from Esau. It's interesting because he has already seen that the army of God is with him. That's great assurance. But even beyond that, he prays to God. And his prayer is interesting because he quotes God back to God. In that very first verse, in verse 9, he says, "O Lord, who said to me, quote, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you." And then he quotes him again in verse 12, "For you said, quote, I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which is too great to be numbered." So just a little reminder to God that I can't die right now. My whole family can't die by the hands of Esau, because you made this promise to me. My descendants are to be as the sand of the sea. I don't know if that was his motivation in quoting God back to himself, but it is interesting that he does do that. And I think this prayer, even though it begins with Jacob calling him the God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac in verse 9, I do believe this prayer is showing Jacob's growing relationship with God. Because he is appealing to him as God, as Almighty God. Anybody have any comments through verse 20?
When you say that this was a big change, and it is, yet his prayer still was kind of making a deal with God. You promised me all of this, and here I am, I've done all this, but you promised me, and so are you going to go through with this? And I think he just doesn't know yet what God really is and how God really is. I mean, that's the way I read this, that he kind of was making a deal God, and we know we don't need to do that. Of
Mhm.
course, he might have needed to
Well,
after all the lying and cheating that he'd done before.
yeah. Well, and he says, you've been too good to me. You've been too good to me. But you know, it's kind of like when push comes to shove. Well, we're there. Push is coming to shove. Like I'm my whole family is being threatened right now. So yeah, it does kind of sound like that. Um, even though he doesn't say, if you get me through this, God, I
Right.
promise, he doesn't say that.
Right.
But I do think this is evidence of his relationship with God growing and beginning to rely on God. Because when you're, and I know I keep using this Yiddish word that, you know, calling you a shyster, but it's a trickster. It's a person who is situationally doing whatever has to be done in order to get what they want. And that is a very entitled and arrogant position. You're not relying on God, you're relying on your own brains and your own wit and your own ability to outwit whoever it is you're up against to get what they have. And so this is a big, big shift in Jacob. Okay, let me read verses, I'm going to read 21 through 25. Genesis 32. So the present passed on before him while he himself spent that night in the camp. So all of the gifts that he was giving to his brother. Now he arose that same night and took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children and crossed the ford at the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and he sent across whatever he had. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, so he being the man wrestling against Jacob, he was not prevailing against him, he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Such a weird encounter. I have to tell you, there are nights I feel like I am wrestling with something, you know, just all night long, tossing and turning. But Jacob is alone with God. Do you think this is how Jacob thought God would respond to his plea, to his prayer?
No.
I mean, would anybody guess that this is how God would respond?
Mm-mm.
It's such a
Mm-mm.
weird response.
Yeah.
You know, I question, why would God wrestle with Jacob and dislocate his hip? Did Jacob imagine that God would that he would have a battle with his brother and the 400 men that his brother has with him, and that God would make him triumphant in the battle? You know, is that what he thought? Because verse 7 in our Bibles, he's distressed over the 400, and verse 9, he begins to pray to God. We don't know, we're not told, but the response is that Jacob does not get a good night's rest. He, a quote I have from this is, he's renamed Israel. We didn't get to that point quite yet, but he's renamed Israel and limps away from the scene with a blessing and a bad hip.
Yeah.
He puts a mark on him for sure. Let me read a little bit more. So verse 26. Then he said, this is the man wrestling with Jacob, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But Jacob, and I'm adding the name for some of the pronouns here, and I'm sorry about that, but I just want it to be clear. And Jacob said, hold on a minute, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. He said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, or he who strives with God. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, where he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. Now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Penuel, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of the hip. Such an interesting idea.
Mhm.
Like Abraham and Sarah, both of them received new names from God. Jacob receives a new name from God. Interesting that Isaac did not receive a new name, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isaac is kind of not much of an issue in this whole story in Genesis, even though he was one of the patriarchs and God calls himself the God of Isaac. You know, he's important, but he did not get a name changed, but Jacob did. Israel means strives with God. And it's as if God is the one to be striven with or considered or regarded, not Isaac and Esau and Laban, because Jacob has been striving with absolutely everyone else except his mother. He was his mother's favorite. So he didn't strive with his mother, he obeyed his mother. But Isaac, he stole what he shouldn't have from Isaac. Esau, obviously the same thing there. And Laban, he's had nothing but trouble and drama with Laban. Laban was the worst. And so it's as if now he's given this name Israel, and God is saying, I am the one to be regarded and considered and striven with, struggled with. Not that Jacob was going to forever be at odds with God, because he's not. He's actually honored with this special name. And obviously, his name is now Israel, which is a name that is now forevermore in the rest of the Bible. So now we've gotten to that place. And that's a pretty important place to be. Let me see what else is in my notes. So Jacob, the supplanter, remember that's what his name meant, is no longer the supplanter. That name has been removed. People are not going to call him Jacob anymore. And he's had a personality change. We can tell by this chapter, great chapter. And he's had a name change that's reflected by God. Anybody have anything to add about Genesis chapter 32? I really thought we'd get to the meeting with Esau. I think maybe I would like to get at least through verse 11. I think we can go through verse 17 if you guys are okay with that, because I would like us to get to this meeting with Esau, just because we've built up to it. So Genesis 33. I'm going to read just verses 1 through 3 at first. Then Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. He put the maids and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. So to this point, the only people who have met Esau have been servants and people that work for Jacob, not family members. And included in the family members are the maids and their children too, because Jacob had children with them. And he sort of puts them in order of value, I suppose. If you read verse 2, put the maids and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. It doesn't say because they were his favorite, but we know they were his favorite. We know that. And we know it later, even more. But like a king would do, he actually puts himself in the front. So that's also a posture of protection for his family. So he will handle Esau. Verse 4. And verse 3 shouldn't be ignored, I guess. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. So not only is he coming to him with kind words, loving words, words that say, I want to reconcile with you, my Lord, my brother. I'm your servant, your brother. Not only is he doing that, not only is he giving gifts, but now, as they're facing each other and he can see him, he is bowing and he is bowing and he is bowing and he is doing it repeatedly, making it very clear that he is in subjection or putting himself under his brother's feet. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Jacob is not in subjection to Esau. Jacob has the birthright and the blessing and the prophecy from God that he would have those, and also the promises from God. He's the patriarch. So in him bowing down to Esau and showing deference to Esau, it doesn't devalue Jacob. It doesn't make him less of the prophesied person. It doesn't make him less of the owner of the birthright and the blessing and the promise of God. But he is humbling himself. And it's to gain Esau's favor, but it's also to have peace with his brother. It's really a beautiful story. And the response, verse 4, then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. That's so precious, isn't it? That's not what you expect this whole chapter to lead up to, but they have this beautiful moment of reconciliation. He lifted his eyes and saw the women and the children, this is Esau, and said, who are these with you? It's, he's seeing his brother's family for the first time. Who are all of these people? They're my relatives. So Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the maids came near with their children and they bowed down. Leah likewise came near. So it's like a introduction really to everyone. Leah likewise came near with her children and they bowed down. And afterward, Joseph came near with Rachel and they bowed down. And he said, what do you mean by all this company which I have met? And he said, to find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau said, what is all this about? And Jacob says, I want to reconcile. I want to find favor. But Esau said, I have plenty. So this is about the gifts. Esau doesn't need Jacob's gifts. He doesn't want Jacob to sacrifice on his behalf for him. I have enough. Esau says, verse 9, I have plenty, my brother. Let what you have be your own. Jacob said, no, please, if now I have found favor in your sight, then take my present from my hand, for I see your face as one sees the face of God, and you have received me favorably. So Esau has shown him grace and he has shown him forgiveness. He's showing loving kindness, just exactly what Jacob said God gave to him, and faithfulness, right? He's not holding his feet to the fire at all. Verse 11, please take my gift, which has been brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have plenty. Thus he urged him and he took it. Sometimes it is the right thing to do to accept a gift that someone is giving you in love and in favor, because it blesses them to bless you. Verse 12, then Esau said, let us take our journey and go, and I will go before you. So now Esau wants them to travel together. But he said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are driven hard one day, all the flocks will die. Please let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I will proceed at my leisure, according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord at Seir. So all we know, the people who are traveling with Esau are 400 men on foot. We don't know anything about cattle. We don't know anything. There's no reason for him to be traveling with his herds. And Jacob is traveling with everything he owns and all of the mothers and the children that are within his family. And it's going to be a slower pace than what Esau is traveling. So that was also very prudent. Verse 15, Esau said, please let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But Jacob said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built for himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the place is named Succoth. So I think we'll stop there. But this is just such a beautiful story. And a lot of times this is not the story that's brought up when we talk about reconciliation, is it? Normally we hear about Joseph and his brothers, which is also a beautiful and sometimes confusing story, some of the things they did. But this is just precious. And this doesn't change everything. It doesn't mean that Jacob is now not going to be one of the chosen ones in the family of God. It doesn't mean that. He didn't give all of that up. But it means that they were reconciled together, that I think really chapter 32 tells us a lot about the change in Jacob and his morals, and his integrity. Go ahead, Nancy. I can't hear you.
And a change in Esau,
Yeah.
because he didn't have to be forgiving. And I mean, he could have still wanted to kill him, but for some reason he doesn't still want to kill him. He runs to meet him.
Mhm.
That's a big deal.
That really is a big deal. It really is a big deal. Sometimes being deprived of your family like that makes you really, really want to be with them. And I love that. I'd love to read that verse again. Verse 4 of chapter 33. Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. I think it almost sounds like he was impatient with all the stuff coming at him, right? They did it in droves. They did it in sections. People and animals. And, where's my brother? Well, he's behind us. Remember, that was the message. Jacob's behind us, coming this way. So almost as if he's had enough and it is time for their reunion.
It sounds like the same, or reminds me of the story of the prodigal son coming home,
Mhm.
and the father rushed out to greet him. But I think 20 years, this is a lot of time to think about and forgive. And they both grew up.
Mhm.
Hopefully they both grew up in 20 years and reevaluated what was important in life. And if Jacob was supposed to get the birthright to begin with, he just did it the wrong way. He
Mhm.
should have just waited on God's time, not did it on his time.
Mhm.
So,
With his conniving mother.
So we
right,
don't
right.
know how much Esau has been blessed. We don't know at this point about his children or his we do know that he had two wives, right? Am I remembering that right?
Right.
Um
And-
we do know
And
that,
hundreds of men.
yeah, hundreds.
Yeah.
Hundreds of men.
That's right. I mean, that's a really good indication of how much he has, because just like Abraham had 300 men that fought with him and they were trained to fight. Here Esau has 400 men at his disposal, plus all of their families, and they're all
Right. And we've talked about how that the training of those people in their armies, they were also included as members of the family
Mhm.
because they all lived together and trained together and worked together. So
Mhm.
that's a big family.
Yeah,
400
Yeah.
men and all their offspring and wives.
that is
Yeah.
a family.
A lot of commitment, isn't it, Nancy?
Yes, ma'am.
So, but we're not told about livestock or land and that sort of thing. But Esau has clearly been blessed. He's clearly been given so much by God, because we know from James chapter 1 that every good and perfect gift is from God. So all of this is from God. And they both seem very content with what they have. The competition between them seems to be gone. And they're happy for each other. How beautiful is that?
Yeah.
It's a really lovely story.
Yeah.
But that's all I have in my notes. Does anybody have any other comments?
It's a great story of reconciliation, isn't it, Jennifer?
I agree. I think it is. And I thought of the same thing as you did with Luke chapter 15 and the prodigal son, because that description of running and embracing and kissing and crying, it
Mhm.
almost chokes me up, just like that, just like the
Yeah.
prodigal son.
Yeah.
Beautiful story.
Teaches us something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So next week we will read the last part of Genesis 33 and go into chapter 34. we might do a little skipping over of some of the stories here because I don't want to get too lost in the weeds because we're really weaving the story of the whole Bible. Remember that. I believe every story is important. I believe there's a reason it's in the Bible. I want to say that clearly. But at the same time, we're not going through every single detail just because we're trying to understand really the whole purpose of the Old Testament and what we're, the themes that we're learning from it. All righty, everybody. I love you a lot.
Thank
Thank
you.
you again, Jennifer.
Thank
We love
you.
you.
Love
Happy
you all.
Easter.
You too,
Everybody
Kate.
take care. Enjoy your
Election,
vacation.
Jana.